Chapter 1. Arrogance and the Palm of Destiny. Paris.1:15 p.m. The warm lights of the La Lune Rouge restaurant danced on the faces of the hurried customers, mixing the aroma of red wine with the discreet sound of the violin in the corner of the room. The restaurant was one of the most sought after in the Marais district, not for the refinement of the dishes, but for the fear and fascination that surrounded his employer, Charles Delacroix. Just 31 years old, Charles was known as a brutal, unempathetic thug with a colossal ego. Raised in wealth, he had made his fortune through blackmail, gambling, and shady dealings. No one challenged his authority, not even the restaurant's waiters, who trembled at his every move. That day, Charles had just lit a Cuban cigar, looking down on the crowded room, when his gaze fell on a young woman. She sat alone at a table in the corner, dressed in a simple blue dress, her hair loosely tied back, and her eyes lost in a disturbing silence. Her name was Jade. She was 26 years old, and a sadness hidden behind the calm smile she wore like a mask. Without any hesitation, Charles stood up and approached her table. The people around her silent, as if they had been warned of something dangerous. "Get up," he said to her, in a low but sharp voice. Jade looked up. She didn't seem scared, just surprised. "You're gorgeous. You deserve something. Just right." From the pocket of his expensive coat, Charles took out a thick wad of money. Without hesitation, he slipped it into her cleavage, between the folds of her dress, under the shocked gazes of the other customers. "Come with me. Now I want you." A moment of sharp silence fell between them. Then, with an almost regal dignity, Jade stood up. Not to follow him, but to look him straight in the eye. "You're a bastard," she said calmly but firmly, man sick with power and empty inside. And without blinking, she gave him a painful slap on the cheek. The restaurant froze. Charles, stunned by the gesture that had humiliated him, felt an explosion of anger and shouted, "Out! Now!" Jade walked out of the restaurant with dignified steps, but she had barely passed the door when her knees gave way and she collapsed on the sidewalk. A passerby shouted for help, and Charles, who was watching everything from the window, felt an inexplicable knot in his stomach. Without saying anything, he rushed outside and called an ambulance. Time seemed to be dilating, as in a heavy, indefinite dream. Charles stood motionless, his hand clenched on the phone, while the cold voice on the other end asked him for the address. He didn't remember clearly how he had dialed the number, he didn't remember what he had said. But beyond the thick glass of the restaurant, Jade lay inert on the sidewalk, and the people had gathered around her like diffuse, faceless shadows. He was looking at her somehow lost, with an uneasiness he couldn't name. It wasn't pity, it wasn't guilt. Maybe it was feared, or maybe a primitive form of consciousness that was finally beginning to awaken in him. In his eyes, her figure was no longer provocative, no longer a shiny toy he wanted to buy. Now she seemed fragile. She had filled the air with dignity a few moments ago, and now she lay broken, with her hair disheveled and her dress crumpled, caught between the gray lines of the asphalt. Charles bit his lips, tasting the metallic taste of his own helplessness. He was angry with himself, but he didn't know exactly why. Because he had spoken to her like that? Because he had seen her collapse and not caught her? Or because, for a split second, he had been afraid that he might lose her, even though he had never had her? When the ambulance arrived, the blue lights reflected in his irises like a condemnation. And for the first time in a long time, Charles felt everything he knew about himself begin to waver. "I want to go with her," he said firmly as the doctors lifted her onto the stretcher. "Only if you're family." "I'm her boyfriend." In the ambulance, Jade was unconscious. Charles looked at her with an anxiety he had never felt before. There was something about that woman that shook him. When they arrived at the hospital, a doctor asked him to wait. After almost an hour, the same doctor came out with a serious look. "Do you have any close relatives?" "No." "What does she have?" "Cancer. In an advanced stage. She's a fighter, but she needs urgent treatment and, above all, support." Charles was stuck. For the first time in his life, he didn't know what to say or what to do. The woman he had tried to buy like a toy was now the purest and most real lesson life had ever given him. In a Paris where everything seemed for sale, he had just found something that couldn't be bought, a true soul. "I'll take care of her," Charles whispered, looking through the window of the door, where Jade slept, pale and fragile. But he didn't know that what followed between them was not just a path of forgiveness, but a love story that would transform him from an underworld figure into a living man. Chapter 2. Waking Up. The diffuse morning light filtered through the hospital ward blinds, drawing warm stripes on the white sheet. The monitors flickered discreetly, and the rhythmic sound of the heart seemed to breathe with the silence in the room. Jade opened her eyes slowly, as if she had come back from a heavy dream. She immediately felt the pain in her chest, then the harsh cold of reality. It took her a few seconds to remember. The restaurant. The money. The palm. The fall. Then, "Where am I?" she whispered. "You're in the hospital. Paris, 10th arrondissement. You fainted." The voice came from somewhere to the left. Jade turned her head slowly and saw him. He was sitting on a small chair, bent under the weight of his strong body. The expensive suit seemed out of place in that sterile room. His eyes were red from sleeplessness. But he didn't seem arrogant, he seemed human. "You? What are you doing here?" she asked in a low voice, more surprised than angry. Charles avoided her gaze for a moment. He cleared his throat. "I was there. When you fell, I came with you in the ambulance. I don't know why. But I couldn't leave. Do you feel guilty?" "Maybe. Maybe yes. Or maybe. It's more than that. You don't owe me anything, Charles. And I don't owe you anything. You can go." He closed his eyes for a moment. It was hard for him to see her so weak and yet so strong. There was a silent force in her that made him feel like a child who had punched a flower. "The doctors told me about the disease," he murmured. Jade froze. She turned her face to the ceiling to hide the tears that were already gathering. "I don't like being looked at with pity," she said tightly. "I don't look at you with pity, Jade. I look at you with shame. Because I treated you like an object. But today, when I saw how you fell, I felt something break inside me. A conscience. Possibly, or maybe a soul I didn't even know I had." The silence between them grew thick. All that could be heard was the sound of the Ford drip slowly. "I don't understand why you stayed," she said more gently. "You don't know me. I don't owe you anything. I'm no one's trophy. I don't want anything from you, Jade. I just want to be here, if you let me." She looked at him for a long time, searching his face. He wasn't the same man anymore. The arrogant boss had disappeared, leaving in his place a vulnerable man, with red eyes and trembling palms. "Okay," she said softly. "You can stay. But don't try to buy me. I don't need your money. I don't want your pity. I won't offer you any of that. I'll only offer you my presence, as long as you let me." "Then, wait." But in silence. "I don't want to talk about cancer. Not today." Charles smiled almost imperceptibly and sat better in his chair. Then, without a word, he took out his expensive watch and put it in his pocket. It was the first sign that he was leaving his world outside, beyond the door of the ward. And in that fragile silence, in the cold hospital, a strange story opened its first page. .1 in which death and love held hands, and an undercover officer learned, slowly, what it means to love a man who doesn't belong to you. After an hour of silence in which Jay didn't say a word, the door of the ward opened slightly. A young nurse, with gentle eyes and quiet steps, entered holding a small syringe and a painkiller. "Hello, sir." "Charles," he answered dryly, without taking his gaze off Jade's pale face. "Mr. Charles, we'll give her something to help her sleep. She's very exhausted." Charles just nodded. Within seconds, Jade felt the fine sting in her arm, blinked once at Charles, and fell asleep, calm, with a fragile expression of peace on her face. "Would you like to come with me to the doctor's?" the nurse asked, as she gathered up the kit. "Yes," Charles answered almost automatically. He followed her down the coldly lit hallways, with heavy steps, as if he were walking to a sentencing. It was the first time in his life that he felt he had no control. Neither money nor threats, nor his power meant anything in front of that word. Cancer. They arrived in front of an office. The sign on the door read Dr. Martin Lefebvre, Oncology. The nurse knocked discreetly and opened the door. "Doctor, this is Mr. Charles, regarding patient Jade.No." The doctor was an elderly man with a calm, tired expression. He stood up from his chair and nodded to Charles, inviting him to sit down. "I understand that you are close to the patient?" "I am someone who wants to help her," Charles said, not knowing exactly how he felt either. "Then you must be prepared to hear the truth. Because I don't have good news." Charles clenched his fists in his lap. "Tell me everything." Dr. Lefebvre took off his glasses, wiped them with a handkerchief and sighed deeply. "Jade has cervical cancer. Stage 4, the disease has spread. It has metastasized. She ignored the symptoms for a long time, more likely she knew, but she no longer had the resources to fight. "Is it terminal?" asked Charles, feeling a lump in his throat. "I don't want to give you false hope. Medicine is not magic. But I can't say that all is lost either. The chances are small, 0.5%, statistically speaking. 5%. The words fell like a guillotine into Charles's soul. 0.5%. He had been through shootings, betrayals, prison, but he had never felt so much fear. What does this mean in concrete terms? What can be done? "We're starting chemotherapy. She's aggressive. She'll suffer a lot. But it's the only option. If she reacts well in the first month, we can talk about a ray of hope. But it's a fight. And a hard one." Charles stood up slowly, trying to gather his thoughts. "I want the best. Hospitals, treatments, doctors abroad. I don't care how much it costs. She deserves the best." Dr. Lefebvre looked at him carefully for the first time. There was something painful and sincere in that man's eyes, a desperate desire to fix what couldn't be fixed. "Money can buy a lot, Mr. Charles. But here, support and patience will matter more. Don't run away when it starts to hurt. Not for her, not for you." "I'm not going to run away. I've never felt anything like this before. It's like everything I've done so far is worthless if she doesn't stay." The doctor nodded and led him to the door. "Then start by being there. Not as a savior, but as a human being." Charles walked out of the office, his steps heavy with truth. This wasn't just a fight against a disease. It was about the fight of his life. For the first time, in the heart of a man raised in darkness, a light sprouted. And that light had a name: Jade. The days passed like a dream in the living room with white curtains and cold walls. For Charles, time had lost its shape. He no longer knew what day it was, nor what was happening outside in the Paris he had once controlled with a single glance. Now, the only universe that mattered was around the bed where Jade fought for every breath. He had not left her side for even an hour. He slept on a folding chair, his head resting on the windowsill, his eyes always on her. He had begun to understand the nuances of pain. The long silences, the suppressed groans, the fingers clenched in the sheets, and, above all, that heartbreaking courage of a woman who sometimes smiled just to reassure him. The day after the first chemotherapy session, Jade's body seemed a thin shell that barely held life inside. When the nurse removed her, Jade began to tremble. Then suddenly, she stood up abruptly and ran to the bathroom, Charles after her. She vomited so violently that it seemed she was detaching herself from her own body. "Jade! Jade!" he shouted, holding her hair and supporting her in his arms, his voice broken by panic. She collapsed onto the cold tiles, sweating, tears mixed with blood at the corner of her mouth. She was breathing hard, as if every breath was a fight. I can't, Charles. It's too much," she whispered, her eyes closed. "No, Jade. Don't give up. Not today. Not now. Listen to me. You can't. So much pain. I don't feel anything anymore. Only darkness. Then fight for the light," he shouted, his voice trembling. He carefully lifted her up and put her on the bed. The doctors intervened, administering sedatives. For several hours, Jade was between life and death. Charles stood at her head with his hands folded and tears flowing shamelessly. At midnight, Jade opened her eyes. She was weak, but alive. "Charles, why are you still here?" "Because I can't be anywhere else. Because I don't want to. Do you realize I might die?" "I know, but not today. Not while we still have a chance." Jade looked at him long. Another woman would have been grateful. But she was Jade. And Jade was the truth. "Even if you could pay to buy me a new heart, Charles, my life can't be bought. But maybe it can be saved." "What do you mean?" She took a deep breath, hard but determined. "I want to fight. But not here. Not just with pills and vomiting and cold beds. I read about a clinic. Somewhere in Switzerland, place where they don't just treat the disease, but the person. Where healing means more than chemotherapy. Where there's hope. Tell me your name. We're leaving tomorrow. We'll charter a plane. Whatever you want, Jade. I don't want private planes, Charles. I don't want to run away. I just want to go. Together. Not like a gangster and a sick woman. But like two people who believe life still has something to offer. You have my word. We're going. And if you have a 5% chance, I'll double it just by being there with you."